I'm your host, Tim Simmons, and today I want to give you some tips for using metaphors to make your speech more powerful. Have you ever heard of Alfred Sloan? He was the head of General Motors during the Great Depression. He once gave a speech where he talked about GM at the time as a great ship in a fierce storm. From that description, you get a sense of danger, of a boat getting tossed around in the unpredictable ocean waves. And you can imagine that everyone on that ship has to work hard to get through the storm, which, like all storms, would one day end. Alfred Sloan was using a metaphor. GM isn't really a ship, and the economy isn't really an ocean. He could have talked about how the company needed to improve its balance sheet during a time of economic uncertainty. But a ship in a storm is a much more memorable and impactful way of describing the situation. And if you read or listen to speeches by great leaders, you'll see they are full of interesting comparisons like this. So, what exactly is a metaphor? Well, a metaphor is when you compare something you're talking about to another idea. For example, time is money. This comparison helps us understand or see something from a new perspective, just as time is money helps us see time as very valuable. Or, as Alfred Sloan said, GM is like a ship, and the Great Depression is a storm. And metaphors aren't reserved just for big speeches by famous people. Metaphors are everywhere in our language. One of the most common kinds of metaphor we use are idioms. For example, we often say, climb the corporate ladder, to mean try to attain higher positions in a company. But saying climb the corporate ladder is more evocative. That is, it has more emotional power. When you're tired, you can say you're running on empty, like a car with no fuel. When you don't have all the right information, you can say you're missing a piece of the puzzle. And when you're waiting for someone else to make a decision, you can say, the ball is in his court. You may have learned some of these idioms, but you may not have known they're all a kind of metaphor. To harness the power of metaphors, you don't have to just learn some idioms. You can create your own metaphors to make what you say more impactful. You might be making a speech or giving a presentation, or you might be negotiating, selling something, or trying to convince your colleagues to support your idea. In all these situations, metaphors can be effective. What exactly do I mean by effective? Well, for starters, metaphors can help to simplify a complex idea. Think again of the idea of a ship in a fierce storm. There are a lot of complex ideas behind the situation of a large company in an economic recession. But the metaphor helps people understand quickly and simply. Metaphors can also appeal to our emotions and imagination. Consider Tropicana, the company that makes orange juice. They could have described the health benefits of their juice and hoped that people make a logical decision to buy their product. But instead, they called their orange juice your daily ray of sunshine. That has emotional power. Who wouldn't want a ray of sunshine in the morning? The Tropicana example is a good one because it is sensory. I mean, it makes you feel something. And anytime you can use a metaphor that helps people see, feel, smell, taste, or hear, it will be more impactful. Think of the difference between saying, "Your idea is not very good," and "Your idea stinks." Or the difference between, "I was glad to hear about Jan's decision," and "Jan's decision is music to my ears." Metaphors also help people remember what you say. Albert Einstein once said, "Life is like riding a bicycle. To keep your balance, you must keep moving." I'll never forget that idea. But without the metaphor of riding a bicycle, it wouldn't stick in my brain. And just think, the first metaphor I mentioned was from almost 100 years ago, and people are still talking about it. Okay, so today, I've talked about the power of metaphor. We've looked at some examples of common idioms that help create impact. We've also talked about how metaphor can help simplify complex ideas and appeal to people's emotions. And as I've discussed, good metaphors are sensory and memorable. In our next lesson, we'll look at some common types of metaphors and one special type called an analogy. That's all for today. I'm your host, Tim Simmons, and today I want to give you some more tips for using metaphors in English. If you tuned in last time, you'll remember that a metaphor is when you compare something you're talking about to another idea. A classic example of a metaphor is "time is money." But if you really want to use metaphors to take your English to the next level, you'll need to learn to think outside the box. Whoa! Wait a second. What did I just say? Take it to the next level. And think outside the box? Well, those expressions are idioms, which is one kind of metaphor. But haven't you heard those expressions a bit too much? I sure have. And that's why I suggest avoiding these kinds of extremely common metaphors or clichés. A cliché is an expression that is used so much that people don't really think about its meaning anymore. And if you use clichés, you won't make a good impression on people. So don't just memorize extremely common metaphors. Instead, make new ones. But about what? Well, in business, we cook up metaphors from many interesting topics. Take sports, for example, which are easy to compare with business. This is why you might talk about performance, or scoring a goal, or coaching. And that's why we use expressions like drop the ball, and down to the wire, and slam dunk. Sports aren't the only source of metaphors. Other great topics are food, war, games, gardening, and mechanics. But really, the list of topics is endless. The important thing is that you use metaphors that connect with your audience and your purpose. So, which topic might be useful if you're trying to motivate your team before taking another company to court? Well, then you might pull out the war metaphors and talk about doing battle and sharpening your swords and attacking the enemy. Or If you're giving a presentation to engineers about teamwork, you might draw on mechanics. For example, you might talk about interlocking gears and a well-oiled machine. These kinds of metaphors are very direct. We are saying that one thing is another thing. But sometimes we rely on longer comparisons between two things to show how they're parallel. For example, I'll always remember when I heard a speaker compare a business to a plant. To paraphrase, he said something like, "A business is like a plant, in that it's either growing or dying. There's nothing in between." He went on to explain how helping a plant grow and taking care of a business are very similar. It stuck with me because it really made sense. He could have expressed all the same ideas about business without talking about plants. But the comparison really helped explain the ideas. We call this kind of comparison an analogy. It's similar to a metaphor, but it's less direct. We compare two things and show how they're similar in many different ways. Analogy helps people understand and remember. It gives them a way to think about something that makes sense to them. One great example of analogy comes from the world of computers. It's an analogy that helped transform computers from big, mysterious machines to everyday tools for the home and office. That analogy is the desktop. On your computer desktop, you've got folders, which contain files and documents. This analogy has become so ingrained that we don't even think about it anymore, which only shows how powerful and lasting analogies can be. So, how do you come up with your own analogies? Well, you start with an idea about a topic that you want to explain. Think about the essence of the idea, its most basic elements, or features, or emotions. Now, brainstorm other things that people are familiar with, that have the same essence. And once you find something that works, you'll find many different ways to show the similarity. Here's my own example for you. Just the other day, I had to give a presentation about avoiding burnout from too much work. So, I thought about how people who work really hard to achieve something need to take regular breaks. Then, I brainstormed other familiar situations that are similar, and I came up with the idea of swimming. Like if you're trying to swim across a lake, you need to stop occasionally to tread water and rest. And you need to look around to figure out where you're going and to appreciate where you are. Without doing this, you won't have the energy or motivation to continue. And in the end, I told the audience they should learn to rest, not quit. And judging by the comments I got after the presentation, I think this analogy really worked for people. And I hope it works for you too. I hope you see how analogy can be a powerful tool in helping people understand and remember your ideas. That's all for today. I'm your host, Tim Simmons, and today I want to talk about communicating clearly in English. Did you know that most of the conversations in English happening right now are between two non-native speakers? there's a German doing business in Malaysia, and a Russian talking on the phone with a Korean, and a Brazilian visiting Spain. And they're most likely using English to communicate with each other. But everyone has different levels of ability. So you have to try extra hard to get your message across. But it's not easy. After all, English is not a simple language. For one thing, it has more words and idioms than other languages. For another thing, there are many different varieties of English. So the English you hear in Singapore or Miami or London can sound quite different. Given this situation, people around the world using a difficult language at different levels, it's really important to be able to communicate clearly. So how can we do that? Well, let's start with pronunciation. Of course, not everyone will or should speak exactly the same. Perfect pronunciation doesn't exist, since there are so many different accents. And this variety of accents makes the language interesting and rich. But it is important that people understand each other. Being clear isn't so much about pronunciation as it is about enunciation. Enunciation simply means pronouncing things clearly and carefully. In fact, most language learners have two kinds of pronunciation. They have a lazy pronunciation they use when they're speaking with people of the same first language or when they're tired. And they have a careful pronunciation. It takes more effort, but if you want your message to be clear, it's important. It's not just a matter of laziness. Sometimes it's a matter of skill. I mean, you might have learned how native English speakers blend sounds together between words. So, would you becomes would ya, and going to becomes gonna. That's great in some situations, and it's natural. But this reduced speech, as we call it, is not always clear. Besides, it sounds a bit too informal in most business situations. Two other things that impact pronunciation are speed and volume. When we're uncomfortable or nervous, we tend to speed up and speak more softly. But speaking quickly and quietly can damage our pronunciation. We're more likely to mumble this way. Instead, slow down a bit and speak a bit more loudly. This will add clarity to your speech, and people will be more likely to grasp what you're saying. Clarity is also affected by the words we choose. The important thing here is to keep it simple. When you're giving someone instructions on the phone or making an important point in a presentation, it's not the time to impress people with your vocabulary. This is especially true with verbs. Don't say produce when you can say make. Don't say proceed to when you can say continue. And don't say consider when you can say think about. In other words, stick to expressions you know people will understand. That means you should avoid using too much slang and too many idioms. Slang and idioms are very regional. I mean, you can ask someone in Australia to meet you in the arvo, but most other English speakers won't know that you mean afternoon. And don't expect people outside the U.S. to understand when you say something exciting was off the hook. When it comes to word choice, there's another thing to be careful with: acronyms and abbreviations. You might use TBH quite often, but not everyone knows that it means to be honest. Others might not know that TBA means to be announced, or that FYI means for your information. You don't have to use these abbreviations to get your point across. And you've probably been confused and frustrated when people use abbreviations that are common in their line of work but are not common knowledge. If I mentioned ESAC in conversation, would you know that I was talking about the Engineering Safety Advisory Committee? Probably not. In fact, if I talked about ESAC, many listeners wouldn't assume that it was an abbreviation at all. They'd be thinking it was some kind of electronic sack or bag. As we've seen, there are a lot of potential roadblocks to understanding someone in English. And communicating clearly might mean we have to adapt what we say and how we say it, depending on the audience. It's always a good idea to speak up and to speak clearly. And if you want to make sure everyone understands, it's wise to use simple and clear words while avoiding slang, idioms, and abbreviations. That's all for today. Business Skills 360, the podcast that looks at the other side of business English. Hello, and welcome back to the Skills 360 podcast. I'm your host, Tim Simmons, and today I want to look at how to communicate clearly in English. There are times when you want to impress people with your language abilities. Maybe you're in a job interview or meeting with some hotshot business people for the first time. Sure, these situations happen. But there are actually far more situations that require the opposite approach. I mean, situations where you don't want to risk confusing people. So you want to make sure you're communicating clearly. Maybe you're giving instructions, or helping someone with a technical problem, or giving a presentation, or talking with someone who doesn't have the same language skills as you. There are countless situations where your focus should be on simplicity and directness, rather than verbal pyrotechnics. In our last lesson, I talked about clear pronunciation and word choice. Today, I want to look at making clear sentences and organizing your message. When it comes to sentences, shoot for simple and short. Rather than stringing a bunch of ideas into one long sentence, break it up into several short ones. For example, here's a sentence that might confuse some people. Although the forecasts are positive, we've decided to cut costs due to current cash flow problems. There are 3 ideas there in one sentence. If you break that up into smaller chunks, it might sound like this. Forecasts are positive, but we have cash flow problems. So, we've decided to cut costs. Notice that I used the words but and so. Those simple linking words are really useful and really clear. There's no need to use nevertheless and consequently if you're trying to make sure your point is clear. Yes, it's important to show the relationships between ideas, but you don't always have to sound like an academic. There's something else that can add clutter to our sentences. The softening words and phrases we use to be diplomatic, polite, or careful. These expressions can be very important when the situation requires, but not all situations or audiences require such diplomacy. I mean, if you're on the phone helping someone fix a computer problem, you don't need to say, "Now, if it's not too much trouble, would you mind trying to restart the computer?" That's ridiculous, right? So, instead, you can just use, "Now, please restart your computer." Or, if you're talking to your assistant, you don't need to say, "I was wondering if you might be able to complete the paperwork sometime soon." No, it's better just to say, "Could you finish the paperwork soon?" Did you notice how direct and simple that question was? In fact, we have some very confusing ways of asking questions in English. And if you're trying to be clear, you should avoid some of these. That includes tag questions, such as, "You're quite busy, aren't you?" And negative questions like, "Aren't you going to read my report?" Many people aren't sure how to answer a tag question or negative question. I mean, if you are going to read the report, do you say yes or no? Confusing, isn't it? All right. The last thing I want to talk about is how we structure our messages. And I mean longer messages, like a set of instructions or something. First off, it's good to be clear about purpose. Tell people what you're going to tell them. That's exactly what I did when I said, "The last thing I want to talk about is how we structure our messages." You see, when you heard that, you knew exactly what I was going to talk about next. You didn't have to just figure it out on your own. Secondly, it's a good idea to use words like "secondly." We call this signposting. Signposting is basically giving clear structure and logic to what you're saying. That means introducing things clearly. It means outlining, using words like first, second, third, and last. But it also means being clear about how your ideas fit together. That might mean using expressions like, "There are several good reasons for this idea," and "Let me give you one example of this situation." Signposting makes it a lot easier for people to follow what you're saying and to remember it. Lastly, it's a good idea to summarize what you've said. Just a little recap is good enough. And you can introduce your summary using signposting expressions like "to sum up" or "what I've been trying to say is." All right, now I'd like to quickly recap. Today, I've talked about how to make clear sentences. Clear sentences are short and simple, and clear ideas are connected with simple linking words. Clear sentences are not full of softening words or diplomatic language, and clear questions are not tag questions or negative questions. Finally, remember to use signposting to help listeners follow what you're saying. That's all for today. If you'd like to test yourself on what we've just covered, have a look at the businessenglishpod.com website. There, you'll find a quiz about today's show, as well as a complete transcript. So long, and see you again soon.